We went to a concert recently just over here at the Ventura Music Hall, and John Mark McMillan, a Christian artist, was playing, and we were really excited. It was Kylie's first concert, and so we were all hyped up and got to the front, got checked in, walked in, and there was like 20 people there. And if you haven't been to a concert with 20 people is kind of difficult to enjoy. You kind of feel like you're at a funeral rather than a concert. You know, the musicians are up there and they're jamming and they're trying to get energy and they're hopping up on the stage and doing all the things, and there's 20 people there. And, there's no mosh pit, not that I would do that. There's no, rave. There's no all that stuff. They're all just kind of standing there 6 feet apart. It felt like COVID all over again. Not fun. It was smaller than we expected, and because of that, sometimes it was easy to be disappointed, and we left early. If you're expecting something big and something smaller happens, it's easy to misunderstand the importance of what's going on. That's where we are in Matthew chapter 13. The disciples needed to understand from Jesus why things weren't as big as they thought they would be. Jesus was getting opposition. He was arguing with a lot of Pharisees who were increasingly not liking him. In fact, the Pharisees had just decided that this guy needs to go. We need to get this guy killed. And there was a large crowd of Jews around him. They were following him, but they were mostly there to be healed or there for free food. And they weren't really lining up under what Jesus said. In fact, they were slowly falling away, and the crowds were getting smaller and smaller. If you think about it, everything for Jesus is about to get really small. Right? Everything for Jesus is about to get really small. He's going to become very unpopular, very unsuccessful, depending on the way you define success. And if you think about it, kids, when Jesus is on the cross, how many people are still following him? Maybe like 2 guys hiding in the crowd. Peter's denied him. The disciples have run away. There are a few women there at the cross. A handful, maybe. And at that point, it would be easy to look at Jesus and be like, this is a failure. Look, there's like 6 people. He was supposed to be the Messiah. He was supposed to bring God's kingdom, usher God's kingdom to earth. This is an absolute failure. And that's what the disciples were thinking when they saw and watched Israelites and Jews start walking away, when they watched the Pharisees and the rulers of Israel start not liking Jesus and opposing Jesus. They're like, ooh, this isn't going well. And so Jesus, in Matthew 13, in the parable of the wheat and the weeds, needs to change their thinking. Redefine success for them. Show them what God is doing, because sometimes it's not easy to see. Look at Matthew chapter 13. We're starting in verse 24. The parable of the wheat and the weeds. Jesus said this, He put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field, but while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in the field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, an enemy has done this. So the servants said to him, then do you want us to go and to gather them? But he said, no, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers who gather all of the wheat, I will tell the reapers Gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Jesus taught this parable, and he explained it to his disciples because they needed to know what God was doing. They needed to see it because it wasn't about numbers. It wasn't about crowds. It was about the kingdom of God. If you're taking notes this morning, point number 1 on your outline is this: the saved and the unsaved live together in the world until Jesus returns to judge. The saved and the unsaved live together in the world until Jesus returns to judge. That's what Jesus wants his followers to see. See, the disciples thought that the kingdom's coming. Jesus is the Messiah. He's bringing God's kingdom to earth, and that means that Jesus is going to save and bring in all of Israel into the kingdom. And even the Gentiles are going to be saved, and it's going to be this massive worldwide movement. And that's not what they were seeing. That's not what they were seeing. And so Jesus tells them this parable of the wheat and the weeds, and then he explains it to them. Look all the way down in verse 36. Jesus explains the parable just to his disciples, just like he did the parable of the sower. Just to his disciples, he said in verse 36, "Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, 'Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field.' He answered, 'The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil.'" This is where we get point number 1 on your outline. What Jesus is teaching us through the parable of the wheat and the weeds is that the saved and the unsaved live together in the world until Jesus returns to judge. It's a mixed bag. That's Jesus' point. It's a mixed bag. The field is the world in which God's children and children of the devil live together in close proximity. And sometimes that close proximity is difficult. Sometimes it's confusing. If you think about it, those of you who own cats, you kind of understand what it, there's these mixture of two things that you don't want. Whenever you walk out of your house and you've got black pants on and you've got cats, you know exactly how that goes, right? You walk out and you walk to work or you're going to church, and then you look down at your pants and it looks like your pants don't belong to you. It looks like your pants belong to your cat, right? And they're just covered with cat fur. And then you're sitting there and you're like, okay, how do I separate the cat fur from my pants? I don't have a cat, by the way. I'm not. Anyway. But, right, and you have to, the cat fur and the pants, they're right on top of each other. They're connected, and they're hard to separate. And so if you're lucky and you got a big purse, you've got a lint roller. Otherwise, you can grab some Scotch tape. But for the most part, you just live with it and hope nobody watches. It's hard to separate. It's hard to get the cat hair away from the pants. And the reality is that that's kind of the situation we're in today. It's kind of weird when we walk out into the world. Here we are, followers of Jesus Christ. We love Jesus Christ, and we live every day amongst people who don't. And it's confusing. It's confusing to us at times. Not everybody loves Jesus. Kids, maybe you've experienced this already. Maybe you haven't. But there are kids in your neighborhood. There are families around your home, and there are kids at school, maybe even family members like aunts and uncles and grandparents who don't love Jesus like your parents do, who aren't following Jesus. And their whole family is different. They've got different rules. They get to do different things. There are different values that are important for them. Some of them get to stay up late and forever. Some of them get to play video games all day long. It's just different. Because your parents love Jesus and they're teaching you about Jesus, your family looks a little different. But here you are, right next to your neighbor. And it's not the same. Because Jesus is not reigning in the hearts of every person in the world today. That's why we proclaim Jesus. That's why we love our enemies, so that more people can come to know Jesus. But it is difficult, isn't it? I mean, our parents, adults, you guys get this. It's kind of regular, everyday thinking, I think especially for our older generation who have watched this transition in our communities and in our culture in America today. As adults, we have this proximity, and it's difficult and it's confusing. Why aren't all the churches mega? Why isn't Christianity the norm? Why isn't following Jesus cool? It looked like it used to be. Right? Wouldn't that be great if America was a Christian nation, if America had Christian rules, if America did things according to the Bible? We sit there and we think like, oh, wow, like we picture following Jesus as though it should be this popular thing that everybody should be doing. And sure, there's some places in the country where it looks more like that. But increasingly in our community, it's not. The parable of the wheat and the weeds teaches us that the world today is a mixed bag. And we live right alongside one another. We wish for more followers of Jesus. We want there to be more worshipers of Christ. But inevitably, in each and every one of our hearts, it's hard to watch the wandering of the world that we live in. Notice in verse 30, Jesus says, or the farmer says, let both grow together until the harvests. Let both grow together until the harvest. That phrase, grow together, it pictures like this interwovenness. The roots are tangled. They're right next to one another. There's not one space that is not inundated. They're all connected. In fact, the farmer talks about how if you were to pull up a weed, you would inevitably pull up wheat with you as well. They were so close to one another, right next to each other. And while Jesus isn't necessarily talking about the church, the picture is obvious that there's no place where non-believers are not, even in the church. He didn't use the word church. He wouldn't. Matthew 16 is the first time Jesus uses the word church. But this also helps us understand what's going on in our church, in the church. Why are there hypocrites in the church? Why are there false teachers in the pulpit and false gospels in the church? Why are there fakers? What about apostasy? Those people who walk away, who used to claim Jesus but have walked away. This parable is an explanation of what we've experienced, perhaps more now in our generation than perhaps in most of American history, that there's this large group of people who used to claim Christ. 10 years ago, they would have called themselves Christians. And perhaps they still call themselves some sort of follower of Jesus, but they've, by and large, rejected the Bible. They're trying to edit Jesus and make him more like what the world says, and they cast out the Apostle Paul, and they're like, right? This idea, what we've seen and watched, perhaps of our friends, of our Christian brothers and sisters, the last 10 and 15 years, many of the bandwagon Christians walked away. Many of the crowd walked away. And Christianity just isn't the popular thing in the world. I don't think it ever was. True Christianity was never the popular thing of the world. But even to the degree that we experienced it in previous generations of biblical values and living according to a certain biblical morality, That's going away. And so there's this movement to make Jesus more appealing, to leave the rules, to leave the Bible, and to just have Jesus who loves everybody and everybody goes to heaven. The world has weeds, and the church has weeds too. That's the warning of this parable. Because the important and essential truth is that Jesus is returning to judge. The parable isn't so much about plants growing next to one another as it is to the eternal destinies of those wheat and the weeds. Look at the end of verse 39 in your Bible. End of verse 39 says, "The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels." It just says, "The weeds are gathered and burned in the fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Notice there's 4 verses talking about the eternal judgment of those who do not believe or follow Jesus. It's right there in the text, and Jesus clearly identifies certain aspects of the parable. The harvest is the judgment. That's when Jesus returns, and he sits on his big throne, and he judges every single human being who will ever exist. Did you believe in me? Did you follow me? Do I know you? Then eternity. Did you believe in me? Did you follow me? Do I know you? No? Well, then eternal judgment. Notice the only thing that's not defined by Jesus' explanation of the parable is the fiery furnace. I mean, he doesn't call it hell. He doesn't define it like, oh, the reapers are angels, the harvest is the end of the age. The fiery furnace gets no such explanation. It's just a picture. It's just a picture. And the picture is actually more powerful. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So kids, look up at me, okay? Passages like this in the Bible can be scary. And to a degree, they should be. But what you need to know is that Jesus is coming soon. He's coming soon. He's going to come and take all those who believe in him, who follow him, to heaven. And he's going to throw, that's the word used in the text, those who don't into eternal hell because they reject him. And this is the description of what it will be like to be there. Weeping and gnashing of teeth. But look at verse 43. Then the righteous will shine like the sun. The righteous will shine like the sun. What wasn't obvious before the harvest, when we all looked the same and we each had our own truth, after the return of Jesus Christ, the difference will be obvious. And those who believed in Jesus, who were forgiven for their sins by believing in him, by his death on the cross, who have experienced resurrection power by believing in him and his victorious resurrection, we shine like the sun for all eternity. For all eternity. Doesn't that sound great? Notice something in this text, verse 43, the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. It's not just the kingdom or the Father's kingdom, it's our Father's kingdom. How great will eternity be when our dad is the king of all things? How cool. How amazing. Jesus says that those who believe in him and follow him will shine like the sun in the kingdom of our Father. Think about that. Shining like the sun. It's not dull, it's not dim, it's not dark. It's bright, it's radiant, it's alive, it's healthy, it's forever. It's beautiful. And best of all, it's with Jesus, the one who made you, who loves you, who has come to rescue you. You get to be with him with no tears, no fear, and every day will be better than the next. Every day will be better than the last. Sorry, I said that wrong. C.S. Lewis is so much better at that kind of stuff. Every day will be better than the last. Never bored, never lonely, never lost, never hurt, never afraid. You'll be home in your Father's kingdom with your Father and all of the family of God's people. That's what Jesus is inviting everyone to. That's why we open up God's Word every week, so that we can see this invitation, so that we can remind our hearts of our inevitable future, of what's coming, so that we would cling to him every day and never, ever fall away. There's nothing better than being with Jesus forever. Nothing at all. Look what Jesus says after the parable of the wheat and the weeds. Look at verse 30. We've jumped around a little bit. But Jesus now tells two more parables. Matthew's parables often comes in sets of three. And you can tell that these two parables are really furthered explanations of the parable of the wheat and the weeds, because they're not only smaller, but they're couched in between the parable of the wheat and the weeds and the explanation of the parable of the wheat and the weeds. So in between, Jesus tells two more parables that he doesn't explain, because they're really there to just further the first parable. Verse 31, he put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like the grain of a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Then a third parable, very short. Verse 33, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. Here's point number 2 on your outline. Point number 2 is this: Jesus wins, and his kingdom will prosper. Jesus wins, and his kingdom will prosper. All these 3 parables are connected: the wheat and the weeds, the mustard seed, the leavened bread, and then the explanation of the wheat and the weeds. It's because the disciples needed to see what God was really doing, because you can't do it by counting. You were to go into churches across America today, the number of Bible-believing, gospel-preaching churches is getting smaller. There are less people in the pews. In the last few years, in Ventura alone, 4 or 5 gospel-preaching churches have closed. And at times like that, it's like, whoa, what's going on here? Is God losing? Is God losing? That's what the disciples are going to feel when Jesus is hanging on the cross. Wait, did we just lose? Was this thing all fake? No. Point number 2, Jesus wins and his kingdom will prosper. Now, some things you need to see in this text. Now, if your kids are smart, you kids know when you read the text that, well, mustard seeds aren't the smallest seeds, and they definitely aren't, mustard trees aren't the tallest trees. In fact, they're not even really trees. If your kids don't know that, just get them some time with John Exel. Okay. He'll teach them all that stuff. Here's what's going on here. The mustard seed was the smallest seeds of the seeds that were cultivated by farmers in the Middle East in the times of Jesus. And they also produced the largest tree that was cultivated for, or the largest bush that was cultivated for a harvest. You're talking 10 to 15 feet at most. Large enough, larger than any of the other cultivated plants of farmers in the Middle East, and large enough for birds to rest in their branches, especially considering the largely treeless nature of the Middle East where Jesus is walking. They would have been the largest plants in semi-urban areas. Not only that, these parables are actually interpreted very vastly differently by good Bible-believing Christians and pastors and teachers. There are some who believe that these parables are teaching the difficulty, that the birds being in the tree are a bad thing. And that's certainly possible. That would line up with the parable of the wheat and the weeds. And most of the time, like in the parable of the sower, the birds were a bad thing, right? And most of the time, leaven in the Bible is a bad thing. But I think that's the absurdity of this parable, right? Jesus teaches something and it's normal and everyone's like, oh yeah, I get that. And then there's one absurd thing. I think that's the absurdity for all these Jews who are listening. Oh, I have to clean out my house from all the leaven every year, and it's exhausting and a long process, and now you're using it as a good thing? Right? Leaven multiplies. It gets everywhere. And so as a picture of the gospel and being the people of God, Israel, in proclaiming the gospel, they would ceremonially go around and clear their house out of all the leaven before Passover. But the parable is not negative, I don't think. Mustard seed is usually a good thing, even though leaven is not. And Ezekiel chapter 17, Ezekiel teaches basically the same thing as the mustard seed, and it's a profitable, positive message reminding Israel while they're away, deported into Babylon, sitting by a river, being ruled as slaves, that God's kingdom wins and his kingdom prospers. We will win. But that's the picture of both of these parables. Something that starts off and it looks insignificant. It looks weak. It looks like it can't make a difference. It grows. And it grows in amazing ways. The seed is the gospel. The leaven is the truth of Jesus. And while it started off very, very small, the truth is the gospel is going out across the world, even now. And in the front lines of gospel ministry, pagan peoples are turning to Christ in droves. Right? Amen? And there are seasons for the church in America. There are seasons for the church across the world. And the truth is, even when we can't see it, the gospel's winning. It's growing and expanding. And God wins. Sometimes it's necessary, especially in our season of the American church, to get an understanding of this. I encourage to you stories of our faithful missionaries. Put them in front of your children. Let them see what God is doing. Some friends of ours are missionaries in Chennai, India, and it was refreshing. They came to Ventura a couple weeks ago, and we got to spend a week with them. Some of you guys even housed them as they took some time off to recover and to recuperate. They were talking about chains being broken in Chennai, India. Demons and demonic power being flattened, and people getting saved all across India. It's a wonderful and necessary truth. The gospel and the church in much of the world is thriving. Go find great gospel reports of the underground church in China. Read Peace Child by Don Richardson, the story of the church in distant places. Why? Because this thing's growing. It had small beginnings. It's microscopic inside. Yeast is, and mustard seeds are tiny. But if you just hide it there in the dough, eventually it takes over. It takes over the whole thing. Every obscure corner will be reached by the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's our job. We make disciples among our neighbors and the unreached nations. Spread it throughout the world. The gospel makes progress. The gospel is the power. You just think about that. The significance of this picture. Think about that small little mustard seed. Kids, if you don't know, that mustard that your parents put on your sandwiches and it's got all the little bumps in it? Those are mustard seeds. They're tiny. But in that little seed, or in any seed, it is like this explosive power to bring forth this huge plant. That's what a seed is. It's like compact, concentrated power, energy. It's a huge battery of stored energy for life. That's what a seed is. And when you put it in the ground, it explodes. You've seen the power of a seed, right? Kids, when your parents walk you, like you guys are taking a walk around the block, you'll sometimes walk on the sidewalk and you're on your bike, and the funnest parts of the sidewalks are the sidewalks that are messed up, right? They're the sidewalks where the tree is grown right next to the sidewalk, and therefore the concrete has been pushed up, and that's not broken, that's a ramp, right, for your bike. That's like the funnest part. Well, that concrete got moved by the power of a seed. That's how powerful the gospel is. That's how amazing the gospel is. That's how powerful it is to believe in Jesus and to tell others about him. The truth is that even though right now in the world there are all sorts of people who believe in Jesus, people who don't believe in Jesus, and we're all just living in close proximity, the truth is that Jesus wins and his kingdom will prosper. Jesus is at this time looking at his few disciples, maybe just the 12, probably just the 11, maybe a little larger group, perhaps 100, and he's telling these parables to them, to tell them and to remind them, hey, look, you want to be on the winning side. You want to be on the winning side. We know Jesus will win because he's God. He was sent by his Father to this earth to die, to resurrect from the grave, so that he might bring to himself worshipers. God the Father isn't going to let the sacrifice of his Son end in a loss. We're sure that he wins because we've already seen him resurrected, victorious over sin and death. We're sure that he wins because he's been reigning this whole time. And we're sure that he wins because he's at work even now, even when it's hard to see on the news, even when it's hard to see in your own families. It's our hope. It's everything to us. And so the exhortation this morning is still keep believing in Jesus. Keep believing in Jesus even when it's looking like it's the fourth quarter, you're in overtime, double overtime, Jesus wins, and it's not even close. Keep believing in Jesus. Keep proclaiming Jesus, because in the end, we will be with him for all eternity. And all God's people said, let me pray for us in our time.